go out of style. So what I'd like to do in the next 30 minutes is just give you a quick introduction to our facility and tell you what we're all about. Then I want to give an introduction to leasing, and leasing is a pretty broad topic. I want to zero in on one specific type of lease, which is the way we do it here. Talk a bit about the advantages of leasing, give you some data from our evergreen program. That's what we call our leasing program over the years. And then I don't want this to be all rainbows and sunshine, so I'll discuss a little bit about some of the disadvantages of leasing as well. So our facility, the Harvard Center for Biological Imaging, we are obviously here at Harvard University. We now have 2 facilities. So we've got one in the original biology building here on the Cambridge campus. And then we just opened in February a new lab in the brand new engineering building, which is over the other side of the river next to the Harvard football stadium in Alston. So because I couldn't do an entire talk without a single microscope image, I had to throw in a couple here real quick. And just let you know, our facility opened back in May 2010. We have this special lease agreement with our vendor, Carl Zeiss Microscopy, where our equipment is continuously renewed and refreshed every 2 or 3 years. And our facility supports a really wide range of basic science. We don't do a lot of translational or clinical science. We do a little bit of that, but primarily we do basic science. And we span a whole range of scales. So these are just examples of a couple studies that came out in the last year. So here's a subcellular imaging study on chromosome dynamics out of the Kleckner lab. We looked at more tissue, sort of cellular type imaging in octopuses out of the Bologna lab, and a link between how stress can actually turn hair gray out of the Shoe lab. And then we've even, we do spend a lot of our time looking at even larger samples. So here's an example of tissue clearing and imaging intact mouse eyeballs. This was out of the Bentley lab. So just an idea, a taste of where we look over a wide range of scales in the area of basic biological science. As far as equipment goes, we now have quite a number of instruments, everything from your standard point scanning confocal or to multi-photon imaging to high throughput imaging. We actually have 3 of these AxioScan slide scanners now, a cell discoverer for multi-plate or multi-well plate live cell imaging, and a number of what I'd call specialty scopes. So we have our light sheet system, which we use for developmental imaging and clearing imaging. We can do super resolution with lattice sim or 3D single molecule localization. We can do some large field of view studies on our AxioZoom. About once a year, we do some laser dissection. And then more recently, we just introduced materials imaging. This is mainly for the engineering folks across the river, with a system that can do a number of different wide field polarization techniques, as well as some reflected confocal. So you'll notice everything here is white and blue. We don't have an exclusivity contract with Zeiss. We are free to purchase from whoever we'd like, but as you'll find out later on, a lot of our budget gets tied up in this leasing system. So, and it's a little easier to do with a single provider. So as far as our users go, we see about 700 individuals a year. We do about 2,000 to 3,000 hours of imaging every month. The majority of our users come from the Cambridge campus here in Harvard, from the Faculty of Arts and Science. But we do get a fair chunk of users from the medical school and affiliated hospitals across the river, and as well a chunk from industry with Kendall Square, sort of the heart of the biomedical network or universe just down the street. A lot of startup companies and newer biotechs come and use our facility as well. So with that little introduction, what I want to talk about is this idea of leasing. So the standard model for microscopy facilities has always been to purchase a microscope or an imaging instrument, either through some internal funding or maybe some donor funding or grant funding, and essentially use it till it dies, and then try and scrounge up some more money for another system. This is really different from what we do in a lot of our daily lives. So many of us, at least many of us in North America, I don't think this is quite as popular elsewhere, but we'll lease our automobile. So every 3 years we can trade it in and get a new car. I think it's quite common that most of us have some sort of leasing deal for our phone. We don't necessarily pay for it all up front. We pay it in installments over the life of the phone. Some of us might lease computers. So I know my lease on this computer that I'm using right now is actually up today. And hopefully our IT department doesn't hack in and try and take it away from me during this presentation. And a lot of industries do this for large equipment as well. So a car manufacturing plant like a GM or a Toyota, they actually don't purchase a lot of the robots that they use for assembling. They'll lease those instruments because they need to replace them whenever they come out with a new model. In the aircraft industry, it's quite common to lease aircraft instead of purchasing them. So the question we had years ago was why don't we do this in the field of academic science or in core facilities? And is there a way to make this work, and is it advantageous? So that's the question I'm going to try and answer today. So before we dive into it, leasing is a really broad category. There's a lot of different types of leases. So I just want to start with a few basic definitions so that we're kind of all on the same page here. So by lease, what I'm discussing is a financial transaction between two parties. One of those parties is the lessor. So this is usually a corporation that's providing some sort of product. And then there's a lessee, who is the end user of that instrument and is obtaining that product from some sort of company. The lessee is going to make regular payments over a set time interval to the lessor. And this is where that's pretty much common in any lease, but where things get a little bit different is down here. And these are components of the lease agreement that are somewhat specific to us. So in our lease agreement with Carl Zeiss retains the ownership of the microscopes, so we don't actually own them at any point. And at the end of the lease, we can either choose to purchase that product outright, or we can renew the lease and replace it with a new instrument. So our lease here is very similar to a traditional car lease in North America, where you have that car and at the end of your lease term, you can decide whether you want to buy it out or whether you want to return it for and exchange it for a new instrument or a new car. So this question of whether to lease or buy is something that's existed for a really long time in industry. So companies go through this all the time, whether it has to do with space, like such as office space, or equipment, car fleets for their employees. And so it's been studied pretty extensively in the economic literature. And I think one of the key studies was this one from 1976 by Miller and Upton. I believe Upton actually went on to win the Nobel Prize in economics. And in this sort of paper that really defines the field that every textbook in economics now references back to, they described 6 situations where leasing is advantageous over buying. So what I want to do is work through those 6 situations and apply them to a microscopy core facility to see if these are at all useful for us. So I know what you're all asking. You're really all hoping that number one advantage is cost, that it's leasing is cheaper. This is the question that everyone asks me right off the bat. Is leasing cheaper? Please tell me it's cheaper. No, it's not cheaper. Unfortunately, it's not cheaper at all. And if I remember back to my one course in economics that I took as an undergraduate student, the professors always talked about this invisible hand of the market. And if leasing was actually cheaper, obviously we'd all be leasing. But what's interesting is we all purchase, but that doesn't necessarily mean that purchasing is more expensive. I think there's a number of ways that you can look at it, but they're fairly equivalent. And it comes down to how you structure your lease. But definitely, I don't want you to come away from this talk thinking that leasing is cheaper. It's not going to be cheaper. At best, it's going to be equivalent to what you're doing as far as purchasing currently. Sorry, the one asterisk to this is if you're a organization that has to pay taxes. So if you're in industry, then there are some tax advantages to it. But for most of us being in an academic setting or a nonprofit sector, there's no advantage here. So these are the 6 advantages outside of cost from Miller and Upton's paper. So they come down to keeping up with the rate of technical improvement, expenditures as far as maintenance of your instrument, end-of-life disposal costs, the overall risk to you as a microscopy facility, the adaptability of your facility to changing users and changing needs in the community. And finally, we'll talk a bit about budgeting. Okay, so as far as the rate of technological improvement goes, I think we can all agree that the rate of technological improvement in light microscopy has been absolutely staggering in the last few years. So I've been here at Harvard for almost 10 years now. And if we take a look at 2 of the major manufacturers and we just look at confocals, we can see in those 10 years, we've gone through 3 generations of instrument. I'm sure we can argue about how much improvement there actually was from one of these instruments to the other. The companies are going to tell us it was an astounding leap forward. I think many of us would argue with that. But I don't think any of us can say that there hasn't been any improvement over these 10 years. So this idea of leasing allows us to keep up, do a better job of keeping up with this rate of technological improvement. And if you think about it, a core that rapidly refreshes their equipment at the same rate of the technological improvement of the microscope, you're going to be able to offer new technologies sooner. And in many aspects, your researchers are going to have an advantage over researchers using other cores that can't keep up quite as quickly with those new technology offerings. The other thing to consider too is this idea of an expected period of asset use. So what I mean by this is we still have an LSM 700 microscope in our facility. So that microscope's 10 years old. People still use it. So something can exist for well beyond this, say, 3-year rate. It doesn't mean that because a 980 is out now, that 700 is non-existent. But I will say that's one of our least used confocals because it doesn't have the same capabilities as some of our newer systems. Detectors are getting older, they're not as sensitive, and so on and so forth. So just because an instrument can last 10 years, that doesn't necessarily mean that you want it hanging around your facility for all 10 years. So as far as maintenance expenditures go, one of the biggest debates that comes up at a lot of these core facility meetings is this idea of, do I need a service contract? Should I have a service contract? The really great thing about leasing is you don't own the microscope, so you don't have to worry about the service contract. The service contract falls on the company who still maintains ownership of that instrument. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm sure we're paying for our service in some form in our lease fees. I know we're paying for our service in some form in our lease fees, but it means we essentially have this platinum service contract built into that lease. And there's a lot of onus on the owner of the system to keep that system operating in peak condition. And there's 2 reasons behind that. One is they're eventually going to get this system back and they're going to have to sell it again. So they want to know that it is absolutely prime tip-top shape so that they can resell it for a reasonable amount of money. The other thing is if that equipment becomes non-functional for a period of time, you may not have to make lease payments on it. So obviously you have a non-functional piece of equipment in your facility, there's no onus on you to pay for something that doesn't work. So this means that the companies themselves want to keep downtime to an absolute minimum, and you may end up being prioritized as far as repairs go on your equipment. So that's an advantage for leasing in the area of maintenance expenditures. Another one that you may not see very often, I know I don't see the cost for this in my facility, but when a microscope does reach its end of life, it needs to be disposed of in some way, especially if it's dysfunctional or non-functioning at that end. And this is something that's becoming more and more expensive all the time, especially if you have a microscope that's been used for live cell imaging and has come in contact with biological hazards, BL1 or BL2 materials. The actual disposal of that system can become quite expensive. It's usually handled by a different division at your institution, or at least it is here. So I never see the cost of this, but this is something that someone at your institution is dealing with when you get rid of an instrument. However, in a leasing environment, when you're just returning it back to the manufacturer, you don't have to worry about this. That's on them to take care of. The next item is the idea of risk. And basically, points 1 through 3 that I talked about, there's all of those, there's some risk involved. So with our rate of technological improvement, there's the risk of your instrument becoming obsolete. If you're buying your instrument instead of leasing it, there's the cost of maintenance and repair. There's a risk to that. There's a risk in this end-of-life disposal cost. You don't know what it's going to be in 10 years from now. And there's obviously competition risk if you're in an area like we are here in Boston, where there's probably 100 different microscope imaging facilities for people to choose from. If you have the oldest equipment, you're not going to have any users in your facility, and you're going to run into some budget difficulties. So these are all areas of risk that we have to deal with as a microscopy facility. And the proportion of this risk, and this comes from Miller and Upton's paper, that's borne by the end user, so that means the core facility here, increases in all 4 areas the longer the instrument is in your possession. So the longer you have that instrument in your facility, the greater your risk is across all 4 of these areas. So the quicker you can refresh your equipment and exchange your equipment, the bigger decrease there is going to be in the risk to your facility across these 4 different areas. So that was their 4th point of risk. Number 5 is adaptability. And I think this is one of the, oh, I'm sorry, that animation didn't work. I think this is one of the things that's worked the best for us. And what it means is that we've been able to adapt the equipment in our facility very well over time to our usership. So one example that I want to give is this idea of whole slide scanning and line scanning confocal. So if you can see in the background here, one of the first instruments that was in our facility was just a wide field upright microscope that had a stage that could hold 8 slides. And there was a lot of groups that were really interested in doing array tomography and scanning those slides. And it would literally take 4 hours to set up 8 slides, to set up a focus map, and to get that microscope running. You'd let it run overnight and you come back the next day and usually half of them were out of focus. That instrument ended up not being used at all, very rarely, for the first 3 years it existed in the facility. When that lease was up for renewal, that was about the time that Zeiss released their AxioScan microscope. We traded in for that system, and that immediately became one of the most heavily used pieces of equipment in our facility. And now we have 3 of them instead of just 1 of them because there's so much demand for them. So that was one good example. Another example is one of the original systems in the facility was a line scanner. So this was Zeiss's 7 Live microscope, if anyone remembers that. And it was used only by 1 lab about twice a month. So it was very rarely being used. And when that one actually came up for renewal was when Zeiss discontinued the microscope. And at the same time, they had just introduced the light sheet. So we were able to trade in that LSM7 Live for a light sheet Z1, which was used dramatically more often. The other thing we've been able to do is vary our capacity for confocal microscopes. So when the facility opened, we had one inverted confocal microscope, which back at the time was a 780. And we had one upright, which was also a 780 with a 2-photon laser on it. The facility had, oh, and we had the 700 as well. The facility has grown in usership over time. So because of that, we've added in additional confocal capacity. So we now have 2 inverteds. For a while, we had 2 uprights. And it also allows us to remove excess microscopes. So when COVID hit, and I'll show you this in another slide later on, we were able to reduce some of that capacity when one of our leases was expiring. Okay. So as far as budgeting goes, I think this is often one of the biggest barriers when you're dealing with administration about trying to negotiate a lease procurement model. And my argument has always been that a lease-based model gives exactly what a conservative academic budget desires, and that's consistency from year to year. So if you have a lease-based model, you pay the exact same price every single year for that piece of equipment. If you're doing a traditional model where you buy a microscope, keep it for a few years, and then buy another microscope, you're always going through these cycles of years where you need a lot of money, and then years where you need very little money, and then other years where you need more money and little money. And you're just going through this horrific sine wave of lots of money and little money, which to me, in any administration that I've ever dealt with financially, this is not what they want. They want you to be able to have this continual budget number from year to year. And so I think this is one of the greatest arguments that you can bring to your administration about why you should go with one of these leasing models. So this was, again, the equipment that I showed you earlier on. The 2 systems here in the red boxes are the only systems that we own right now. The rest are all leased. And you can see over the years, since we opened in 2010, we only had 3 leased systems. By the end of this year, we should be up to 13 leased systems. So we've been very happy with the way this goes, or with the way this program has gone. And we've been continually expanding it year after year. When it comes to entering into one of these lease agreements, like I said, there's all kinds of things that can be negotiated and are going to be different in any lease agreement. These are 3 things that we negotiated in our lease agreement, which I'm really happy that we did. So the first one was coming back to that idea of service contract. The service contract is included in the lease price, and not only for Zeiss's components, but any components in that microscope. So one of the key items here are third-party cameras. When you have a Hamamatsu camera or photometrics camera, that's included, and also lasers too. So something like a 2-photon laser is obviously pretty expensive. You don't want to have to be taking out another additional service contract on that. Another thing that we negotiated was to have an embedded Zeiss specialist on site. So we have an employee of Zeiss that's here in our facility 70% of the time, which is very useful and helpful for us. They assist in training and also giving feedback to development teams back in Germany. And then we've also negotiated a number of incentives. So the biggest one is that our lease fees get lower the more equipment that we add, which has been very helpful in allowing us to expand the equipment in the facility over the years. What are the big disadvantages to this? One is that I told you about you being able to adapt your equipment to your needs. Unfortunately, this decrease in equipment levels can't be instantaneous. So here's the growth in imaging hours in our facility over time up through 2019. Obviously, in 2020, something happened. That was COVID, and we had a dramatic reduction in the number of hours. Our facility was actually closed for 2.5 months. And then this year, this orange bar here is a projection of what we're looking at getting to based on what we've built so far through March. It looks like we're going to be pretty much back to normal. So during 2020, we were looking for ways to cut budgeting. We gave back one of our confocals that was coming off lease. Now we desperately want it back, and we're going to have to wait at least 6 months for that purchase order to go through and for the microscope to be delivered. So although we do have this flexibility that's nice, it's not as instantaneous as one might like or might hope for. The other situation, and this is the one I'm always asked about, is whether these instrument transitions affect individual experiments. And so I told you about the 7 live instrument that we had. There was one lab that was fairly reliant on that instrument. And it did affect their experiments when that instrument had to leave. Luckily, we were able to find another system nearby on campus that they could transition their experiments to. But this is something that you have to worry about to some extent. It's not nearly as bad as I thought it would be. The majority of the time, we're replacing a point scanning confocal with a point scanning confocal. It's not that big of an issue. There are very few complaints about it, but every once in a while, you do have one of these situations where you're changing technologies completely, and that is going to affect users to some point. So you have to make sure that you're really transparent and give them as much warning as you can. Great. So as far as a summary, leasing allows you to keep up with the rapid technological advances that are occurring in microscopy. It helps you can maintain a consistent equipment budget from year to year. To some degree, you can adapt your equipment to your user base, whether that be based on technique or based on usage. And this does help you reduce the budgetary risk to your facility, reduce equipment failures and downtime. Like I said earlier, it's not going to save you money, and it's not going to necessarily prevent a budget disaster when there's a global pandemic. So if you're interested in some more information about this was a really brief overview, but Yupeng Wang and Yupeng's a graduate student at the MIT Sloan School of Management, so none of the business knowledge that's in this paper is due to me. This all came from Yupeng. So we wrote this paper recently in EMBO Reports that you can go check out that has some more detail. And the other people that I should acknowledge very highly for this work is this whole Evergreen program here at Harvard was actually established before I came. It was primarily the brainchild of Jeff Lichtman, one of the professors in the Department of Molecular and Cellular Biology here, and Jim Sharp, who was a former North American president of Zeiss, Carl Zeiss. And they worked out this idea of leasing to support continual renewal of instruments in our facility. So with that, I don't think we're doing questions. I think we're going to do some breakout rooms, but I'll turn it back to Gleb.